A lot of Americans are rather surprised to find they're at war with Iran. American service personnel have died, and yet the public are asking, why was this war necessary, especially at this moment? What is the United States trying to achieve? How long might it last? These are some very big questions, especially at the point when the Defense Secretary says they're only just at the beginning.
Americast from BBC News.
We can talk now to Robert Malley, and he was one of the lead negotiators of the 2015 nuclear deal that was done between the US and Iran under President Obama, and he was the US special envoy to Iran under the Biden administration. And so he has actually dealt with these Iranian negotiating teams talking about trying to put limits on the development of their nuclear program. Thanks very much for joining us, Robert.
Yes, hello.
You have actually been in the room speaking to the Iranian negotiating team about exactly these topics. Is there a deal to be done there, or does the regime ideology mean it's just never going to be possible for the US to get what it wants?
Yeah, so first I'd say the people that we were negotiating with, they're the people who the Iranian regime would put to the outside world. So I'm not claiming that we knew myself or other American negotiators knew the core of the regime. The foreign minister is not somebody who is deeply connected to the IRGC or to the center of gravity of the regime. But I think certain things are pretty evident. In other words, this is a regime that is both deeply ideological, but also has sort of its main priority is survival and the perpetuation of the regime. And if what the Trump administration was asking, as Steve Witkoff, the envoy at one point said, was capitulation, I don't think you need to be an expert in Iran. You probably just need to be an expert in human nature to know that that was not going to happen. And the fact that he said in the midst of these negotiations that President Trump was, I think his word was, frustrated that Iran did not capitulate when the alternative was, a war that Iran was certain to lose, I think that said much more about the mentality on the US side than it said anything particularly revealing about the Iranians.
One of the things that Trump said about those negotiations was that Iran would agree to something or seem to agree to something and then back away, that they were basically just stalling for time and that they were not negotiating in good faith. From your experience when you were negotiating with the Iranians, did you feel like during your negotiations they were operating in good faith and that they were trying to legitimately reach some sort of an agreement with the United States?
I mean, I don't know what to make of the term good faith. Yeah, they played games. They would present something, then they might take it back. Their goal was to stretch this out, and often it was. And I have no doubt that they were trying to stretch out the talks with President Trump. But we did reach a deal. I'm sure that people could criticize the deal, but one thing I don't think one could say with a straight face is that Iran violated the deal. Iran was not just abiding by the deal based on what it said. It wasn't just abiding by the deal based on what the IEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, claimed. Even the Trump administration validated the fact that Iran was abiding by the deal between the time it took office and a year after President Trump withdrew. So, good faith, bad faith, I don't know. What I do know is that they negotiated a deal. They were abiding by it. I'm not going to make a moral judgment about whether this is a good faith regime or not. It has certainly lied and killed quite enough for me to shy away from that characterization.
In hindsight, do you feel like it was a good deal? Now that we're looking back, do you have any regrets that you weren't able to get anything more in it or make it a more durable deal that the Trump administration wouldn't have torn up shortly after coming into power in 2017, and now obviously moved on to outright warfare with Iran?
So it's a great question. I don't know that any negotiator in the world doesn't end a negotiation and think, well, if I got this, I probably could have gotten something better. You always look back and say, if I pressed harder, since they did accept X, maybe they could have accepted X plus one. I also think, yeah, probably there are things that could have been stronger. What I do know is that President Obama had one objective, which was to deal with this issue. As he put it, he wanted Iran to be at least 1 year away from being able to develop a bomb if it rushed to it for at least 10 years. That was the mandate. That was achieved. The other thing I'd say is it's rare in history that you have two pathways that you could compare in only a few years distance. One pathway was the one President Obama chose, which is a negotiated deal. As I said, years after the deal, even a year after Trump had withdrawn from it, Iran was abiding by the deal. Their nuclear program was in a box. They had no ability to dash for a bomb and get it quickly. And if they had tried, if they had started to go down that path, as I said, the United States and its partners had at least a year to deal with that, whether it was militarily, diplomatically, or other ways. Then we have the counterfactual. And again, historians rarely have the luxury of being able to compare two pathways. The other one was President Trump. He withdrew from the deal. He imposed maximum pressure sanctions, and he and his the U.S. officials said the sanctions are going to be so crippling that Iran is going to have no choice but to come back to the table and sue for terms that are going to be much better for us. What did we see? Between 2018, 2021, 2024, 25, Iran's nuclear program grew exponentially. But the last point I'd make, you said, do you think that maybe there could have been a deal that would have survived President Trump? No, I don't think that the kind of deal that President Trump would have accepted was realistic. Because again, if the test is zero enrichment, Iran has to give up its nuclear program de facto, that we could never have achieved. We could have achieved maybe a deal that was marginally better. I am convinced that President Trump would have torn it up no matter what.
And that's partly just because Donald Trump has such an incredibly different way of approaching negotiations, foreign affairs, all of these kind of things. And it's often speculated about whether his unpredictability, the fact that he's prepared to do things like suddenly launch a war on Iran one weekend, actually is a real strength in foreign affairs. And you could never imagine President Obama or Biden doing anything like this. But does it therefore give him a stronger hand when it comes to remaking the world as he would like to see it? Because for all the quibbles people have about the manner in which he's going about this, stopping the Iranian regime from getting a nuclear weapon is the same goal everybody is trying to achieve. He's going about it very differently in a way that might be effective.
In some ways, his unorthodoxy could help, right? I mean, he is immune to the laws of political gravity, and he could do things like press Prime Minister Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire, like open channels to Hamas, and yes, like sometimes playing sort of the crazy man to try to get things done. But in this case, if he had used the leverage of threatening war and achieved a deal, people could have looked back and said, well, maybe this was a smart move. But it didn't work. And we're at a war now that, again, is unjustified, unlawful, extremely dangerous. I'm sure we'll get to it. But, even in the best scenario, the best case scenario that one could conjure up, it's hard to see how this ends well.
Now, Trump said that if we hadn't launched these attacks on Iran, that Iran would have had a nuclear weapon within 2 weeks. Now, I know you don't have the intelligence in front of you, but knowing what you do about where Iran was now, is that a justification that is valid? Was there any kind of evidence, do you think, supporting something like that?
So this is one of those rare cases where intelligence wouldn't make any difference. This is just pure fabrication. There's nobody who has any sense of what Iran, their capabilities were, who could make that claim. Let's assume that Iran's nuclear program had not been obliterated, destroyed, whatever term you want to use, back in June last year. Let's just, for the sake of argument, assume that that was the state of Iran's nuclear program. Even then, it would have taken them, I think the estimates were at least 6 months, maybe 9 months, maybe longer, to try to develop a bomb because they didn't have a military program. The flimsiness of the argument, I think, is demonstrated by nothing more powerfully than how they shift the argument for why they went to war and what the objectives of the war are. I mean, it really is not only a matter of changing the version on a daily basis, it's hourly.
One of the other explanations put forward is that Iran's stock of conventional ballistic missiles was a real threat to US targets in the region, the possibility of them developing an intercontinental missile that could hit the United States in the coming years. What do you think is the state of Iranian weaponry? Can we see them having enough to sustain this for a long time, or does the response we've seen so far show that actually that was a bit of a paper tiger as well? They were not as dangerous as Donald Trump wants us to believe.
So, no, I think it's a good point. I believe, based on what we've seen since October 7th, 2023, that Iran's military simply is no match to Israel's or the United States, certainly not the combination of the two. One of the reasons that the US and Israel are waging this war is precisely because Iran was weakened and was relatively weak. And they knew that. And so this notion that Iran is 10 feet tall and that it presents such a threat, again, never stood the test of logic or any scrutiny. I think right now, that kind of capability that Iran has, I think it was always exaggerated, and it has probably been very seriously degraded as a result of the last few days of strikes. That doesn't mean that Iran doesn't have responses. It has responses that are asymmetric, whether it's terrorism, whether it's drones, whether it's other means of warfare. And again, that's why I say, even in the best case scenario in terms of the American and Israeli war planners, it doesn't mean that you have stability, that you have a new government that's going to be, oriented towards the West or friendly towards Israel. At best, from their own perspective, it's chaotic, it's fragmented, it's violent. You may have a civil war, and you have hundreds of thousands of people, maybe more than that, not just in Iran, but across the region, who for ideological, political reasons are going to have only one goal in mind: revenge.
The US has always been known, or for the last few decades, been known in Iran as the Great Satan. Partly for its support for Israel, also because of other policies towards Iran. And that has been consistently the case for decades, whoever the president is. Is there a really significant difference, do you think, in Iranian perception of America when you're dealing with Presidents Obama, Biden, or Trump?
I don't know. I actually thought, and this is why I was maybe naively more optimistic than I ought to have been, that President Trump had a better chance of reaching a negotiated deal with Iran for several reasons. Number one, because the Iranians felt that a deal with President Trump would survive the political waters in America. That unlike President Biden or a President Harris, if they were to negotiate a deal, it would be vulnerable to the next Republican president, who is going to actually question, challenge, or tear up a deal negotiated by President Trump himself. So I think they felt that that was a safer bet. And I have to say, in the negotiations that we led under President Biden between 2021 and 2023, that I led, one theme that the Iranians would always bring up was, how do we trust that you're not going to do the same thing you did last time? And we would tell them, we can't give you any guarantee. And I think that was an obstacle that we were never able to overcome. I'm not saying it was the major one, but it was an important one. As I said earlier in response to your question, here's a president who defies orthodoxy. He was prepared, I believe, to lift parts of the primary sanctions against Iran. In other words, to authorize direct commercial ties between Iran and the US on the argument, which is not a silly one, that one of the flaws of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal was that it allowed Iran to improve its economic situation, Europe to trade with and make money with Iran, Asia to trade and make money with Iran. The one entity that didn't benefit economically was the United States. And I think Trump thought, that's absurd, that's ridiculous. Number three, the point you made, yes, he's also a president who's unpredictable and who could one day order war. And the combination of those three, I think, made this presidency more capable of reaching a deal with Iran if they adopted a rational, realistic approach, which apparently they did not.
Is that still possible? Can we go through a few weeks of a punishing military campaign against Iran and that gets the regime, or whatever regime takes charge, back to the table and produce just that result that you were describing?
I just think it's very hard now. I mean, just think the killing of the supreme leader, the killing of the leadership, innocents obviously being killed as well, the country being destroyed. I don't know how you negotiate under those conditions, anything, again, other than the terms of a ceasefire. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, there'll be a leadership that emerges and is prepared to negotiate. It's not impossible. It's not the most likely scenario at this point. I think the most likely scenario is an Iran that is weakened, debilitated, chaotic, fragmented, but with the regime still more or less in control and not interested in negotiating with the US. And frankly, not sure the US would be interested in negotiating with it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your perspective on that, Robert Malley. It was great to have you on the program to get that kind of insight for somebody who has been in the room for this sort of thing. Is it invaluable at times like this?
Thanks very much.
It's great having you on. That was a fascinating conversation. I think one of the most interesting things was what he said to you, Sarah, there about how the possibility was there for the Trump administration to negotiate something with Iran, that they might have been even more open to negotiating with Trump than they were to Biden. And that, I think the history books may record as a missed opportunity here.
Yes, that idea that Donald Trump does have a kind of almost unique power on the world stage if harnessed properly, but one that they've not chosen basically to use in this instance when they've gone for the option of a military campaign instead.
This is obviously going to go on for quite some time, and we're going to be dealing with the repercussions of Trump's decision to end negotiations and start war for perhaps the rest of his presidency.
Well, we should leave it there for now. Bye bye.
Goodbye.